When it comes to video games, everyone has a different opinion. Everyone's taste is different. But sometimes the masses come together to voice a majority opinion on a single entry or an entire franchise. Today, we'll be taking our first look at 3 single entries in specific franchises I think are underrated. Or, more specifically, today, I'm going to be talking about Bioshock 2. Bioshock 2 released in February of 2010, almost 3 years after Bioshock 1 released in 2007. And by the end of its first month, it had outsold Bioshock 1 and its lifetime sales by that point. Over those 3 years, Bioshock 1 sold just over 1 million copies, and Bioshock 2 in the end of its first month had shipped over 3 million units. Unfortunately for Bioshock 2 though, interest in the game would die off rather quickly, meaning that its impressive first month was about as good as it got for the rest of Bioshock 2's lifetime. In recent years, with the release of the Bioshock HD collection, fans got to relive and experience Rapture and Columbia once again. And it seems like history had repeated itself. Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite are still seen very favourably in the public eye, while Bioshock 2 got a lukewarm reception at best. And the reception Bioshock 2 received back in 2010 and even with the re-release of the HD collection has always confused me. Let's have a look at the story and then we'll discuss the key changes Bioshock 2 made over Bioshock 1 and how I came to the conclusion that Bioshock 2 is the best boy. Rapture is getting ready to celebrate the coming year of 1959. We are peering through the porthole eyes of a Big Daddy, who is following his little sister through the ongoing parties of Rapture. The little sister rushes off and the Big Daddy picks up speed trying to follow her, and before long he hears the little sister crying out and begins to barrel through Rapture. Here he sees splicers assaulting the little girl, jumping the ledge and crushing a poor fool underfoot. He fights off the splicers in a gruesome manner before he's caught off guard and hit with a hypnotized plasmid. A woman then walks up to the Big Daddy, berating him for guarding the girl, and then hands him a gun and instructs him to kill himself, which he obliges.
Five.
Snap forward 10 years later, and we see the Big Daddy from the opening cutscene being revived in a Vita chamber. This is where we as players realise that for Bioshock 2, we get to take the reins of a Big Daddy, codename Subject Delta. As Delta is coming to his senses, he's contacted by the little sister he was charged with protecting, who is now all grown up, called Eleanor. She explains that her mother is holding her hostage and she wants to be freed. This is the major setup for the motivation we have as players to continue in the story. Another big motivator is the fact that the longer Delta is away from Eleanor, the weaker he becomes, meaning that with each step he takes, every enemy he cuts down, he is one step closer to slipping into a coma. Bioshock 2 being set 10 years after the events of Bioshock 1 means that we are playing after Jack killed Andrew Ryan and brought Frank Fontaine down. In doing this, Jack ended the civil war between the two factions, but also formed a power vacuum. And this is where former political rival to Andrew Ryan and Eleanor's mother, Sofia Lamb, steps in. Sofia Lamb has now risen to power and taken over Rapture. She's gathered the splicers who are now lost and leaderless under her wings and unified them in what is essentially a cult that she has called the Family. And like many who rise up to oppose and fight oppression, Sofia Lamb, through the story of Bioshock 2, finds herself in the same position of Andrew Ryan, the man she held in such low opinion. Now, even though I hold Bioshock 2 in such high regards, it would be remiss of me to not point out some flaws of the game, and unfortunately, in the case of Sofia Lamb, she is one of the weakest links. As an antagonist, she just falls flat on her face. Similar to Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2, Sofia Lamb will occasionally radio in and belittle and undermine all of the actions you've done on your quest to save Eleanor. But unlike Handsome Jack, who is an actual threat and oozes charisma, Sofia Lamb comes across very monotone and petty when she talks to Delta.
That is a child of the family, not a toy for you to exploit and discard. It is fitting that you expire here. One more forgotten curio in Ryan's shrine to the self.
Who talks like that? You can hear through the tone of her voice, she thinks she's very deep and philosophical. She thinks she's super smart, but you can tell from her tone, she often likes to take deep lungfuls of her own farts. On top of Lamb, many criticised the story of Bioshock 2 for being short and not as in-depth as 1 or mind-screwy as Infinite. But I personally think this setup is handled rather well. We established the main players and their roles, the risk and consequence of not saving Eleanor, the game's antagonist and the enemy forces you will have to overcome. The intro is short and sweet and gives a real sense of urgency when control is finally given to the player. Bioshock 2 for returning players is like slipping on an old pair of comfortable shoes, except now these shoes can shoot lightning from one lace while the other lace fires off a machine gun. That is to say, while combat is largely unchanged, there are some new features and quality of life improvements included. Gone are the days where Jack would have to choose between either shooting a gun or firing off a plasmid. Delta is built different and has no time for faffing around with choices like that. We can now use a weapon and a plasmid in a union of lightning and lead, or fire and lead, or ice and lead. There's a lot of elements to combine with lead in this game. Staple plasmids like Incinerate, Winter Blast and Electro Bolt return, along with Telekinesis and a few others, but we now also have the Scout Plasmid, which allows us to recon areas and plan ahead of time. We now also have the Decoy Plasmid as well, so we can draw enemy fire to a specific location while we flank them. Hypnotize Big Daddy is now the universal friend button, affecting any enemy it hits. And like Bioshock 1, we also have tonics, and plenty of old ones return, but we also have a slew of new ones. But there's way too many to list off here, so I will leave that up to you to research into. Plasmids can also be upgraded multiple times. Electro Bolt, for example, starts off as just a simple zap of electricity. Electro Bolt 2 is an even bigger zap of electricity, and Electro Bolt 3 is just essentially Sith lightning. And while Incinerate and Winter Blast may have a similar final upgrade in allowing you to release a torrent of their respective element, plasmids like Telekinesis go from having you pick up objects in the environment to picking up corpses, and its final upgrade just allows you to force pull anyone to you, living or dead. Now that's just the left hand. Let's talk about some of the hardware Delta's packing in his right. The right hand is your gun hand. Weapons from Bioshock 1 aren't really present in 2. Instead, we have some Big Daddy flavoured goodness to play with. The pistol is now a heavy-duty rivet gun, which can fire trap rivets for setting up ambushes and heavy rivets to do more damage to armoured foes. The shotgun is now a double-barreled boomstick. The Tommy gun is now a minigun, cause why not? Crossbow? No. Spear gun. Grenade launcher? Too many syllables. Launcher. The research camera is now a video camera instead of a Polaroid, and the wrench is cool and all as a melee weapon, but have you tried drill recently? And we now have the remote hack tool, a godsend item to help hack turrets and cameras safely from cover. And we can all rejoice as that stupid pipe hacking minigame from Bioshock 1 is done away with. Instead, we have a very short and sweet timed minigame. Now, while not much has actually changed in terms of core mechanics, it's still a breath of fresh air from Bioshock 1, just with the simple fact that we can use a gun and a plasmid in tandem. This means combat is a lot more frantic and fast-paced, more enemies, bigger health pools, more ammo in the environments. But it should be mentioned that even with health upgrades, it really feels like Delta got the short end of the stick in his Big Daddiness. Even though we are a Big Daddy, we still feel really fragile, unlike Delta's other work colleagues, the Bouncer and the Rosies. I don't know if this is due to him being an early model, but you fight other Alpha series in the endgame, and they can take a beating. Overall though, the combat loop of Bioshock 2 does feel like a big step up from Bioshock 1. It's a lot more fast paced and frantic, which means it's a lot more fun to experience and experiment with. But if that's not your bag and you just want to run and gun, I think we can all agree that the simple addition of just being able to fire off a plasmid and shoot a gun at the same time was a vast improvement for Bioshock 2 and a real game changer. Now, I mentioned using the plasmids to experiment on enemies, so what kind of enemies are we gonna see? Well, it should come as no surprise that the splicers are the returning faction here, as well as 4 new enemy types. Returning though are the lead-headed, thuggish, spider and Houdini splicers. The nitro splicers are gone, instead the lead-headed splicers can now throw grenades. Filling the void though is the new brutish splicers, who mix up gameplay a little bit, with the fact that they look like a tank, hit like a tank, and take damage like a tank. They are surprisingly nimble, opting to jump and move around the levels while picking up and throwing large chunks of debris at you from a distance. But if you do choose to take the fight to them, or are unfortunate enough to round a corner into one, they will let you know what your own teeth taste like. The iconic Big Daddies also return. The Bouncer and Rosie are here, but now we have the Rumbler and Alpha series as well. They're more mobile than the Bouncers and the Rosies, and they pack weapons similar to Delta, making them a lot more of a threat than any other variant. Well, that would be true, if it wasn't for the Big Sisters. Big Sisters are Sofia Lamb's solution to little sisters who grow up, putting them in their own diving suits and giving them access to plasmids unlike other Big Daddies, jumping around the environment like the brutes but with a lot more speed and grace and finesse. They act like mini-bosses, appearing after dealing with every little sister in a given level, and from the start to the end of the game, they are always a challenge to deal with, even more so when you start having to fight 2 of them at a time. I love Big Sisters as enemies. They are a really great addition, and they mix up the flow of combat a lot more than already has been done so far. Taking down a Big Sister feels like this huge achievement though, like you've overcome some really dire odds considering the position you're in on this unending march towards death. Like, even though you are slowly slipping into a coma, just your will and drive to save Eleanor is just pushing you through these tough times, anime style. Like, Delta is a shonen protagonist and we didn't realise. One thing fans may be glad to hear is that exploration is still very much a thing, but admittedly, it's not as good as Bioshock 1. In Bioshock 1, we played as an outsider to Rapture who was discovering the history of the city and its people, and the game had a more heavy emphasis on horror and survival. Exploration was slow and tense, but usually rewarded the players with new plasmids, tonics, and lore. Bioshock 2 still has these moments, but with the updated combat loop and how everything is a lot more reactive, the tension tends to disappear in these situations. And while you do still get new plasmids and tonics, usually at the end of these you're more than likely to find just more ammo, medkits, or audio tapes. The level design is a tricky one to tackle. It's using the exact same art style as Bioshock 1, it's Art Deco 1960s set design, but it doesn't feel like they do anything new and interesting with it. Bioshock 1 had all these cool areas you could go to that, even though they shared an overall aesthetic, they were very distinct in terms of design and layout. Think of Arcadia, for example, an underwater farmer's market complete with its own little park and foresty area. The closest Bioshock 2 kind of gets to a florally inspired area, and this is at a push, is Dionysus Park. Dionysus Park for the last 10 years had been flooded. This was brought on by one Stanley Paul, who was living a lavish and boisterous lifestyle in Sofia Lamb's absence while she was in jail. And to hide the fact that he had spent all her money and brought the place to ruin, he chose to flood it and bury the secrets with it. This means when you drain Dionysus Park 10 years later, the environment is very alien almost. Coral is everywhere. All of these aquatic plants have taken root and seaweed is lining the environments. Very much like a temple lost to time. But with the absence of water and everything now drying out and leaking, it feels more post-apocalyptic than most other parts of Rapture does. But even with this more unique setting, it still doesn't feel too distinct from any other location in Bioshock 2. The real criticism here is that the environments don't feel like they could have been pushed as much as possible. Sander Cohen's theatre and his whole part was very interesting and just surreal to experience. It feels like we should have had more locations like this in Bioshock 2, push the boat out a little bit more with the NPCs that we were coming up against. And I'm probably going to catch a lot of flack from this, but I suppose you could probably argue that this could be a case of not broke, don't fix it. The themes and aesthetic of Bioshock 1, even to this day, are loved and adored by almost everyone who plays it. So with the return to Rapture, it makes sense that this theme and aesthetic is going to be the most predominant thing you notice. Except now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, everything is a lot more rundown and decrepit. And take that as you will. I know I've rambled on about it for a few minutes now, but this kind of level design and layout, for me at least, isn't a game breaker. I can live with this. I am happy to explore what is on offer, regardless of if there are any new aesthetic themes put down. Now I know it sounds like I've mostly been negative about this game that I supposedly love, and while I wish I could go back to talking about positives, I have two more issues for the game I need to get off my chest. Now this is going to sound really petty, this really is a nitpick, but one thing I never got used to while playing this game was weapon and plasmid switching. More the plasmid side of things. Weapons, as you might expect, are lined up on your number keys 1 through 9, much like every other FPS game on a keyboard. But the plasmid are on the F keys, and when you're in a firefight and the heat gets turned up, having to take my hand off of the keyboard almost completely to hit one of the F keys is an absolute nightmare and a huge pace breaker. Now I get I could have changed the key bindings in the menu, but I don't usually do that for games unless something like crouch is bound to alt for some ungodly reason. I think the solution here is really simple. You take the radial menus from the console and you implement them into the PC version. Bioshock Infinite has a radial menu for its vigors, so there's no reason to think that, at least in the HD re-release, they couldn't have put a weapon wheel in the game. And again, this is just a nitpick because as finicky as it is, it doesn't make the game unplayable. And I did eventually end up rebinding telekinesis and electrobolt to my mouse. Now, my final issue with the game comes in the form of one of the mechanics it chooses to implement in regards to how Little Sisters are handled in this game. When it comes to Little Sisters in Bioshock 1, it was a simple two-step procedure. You kill the Big Daddy and then you either harvest or save the Little Sister. In Bioshock 2, because we are playing as a Big Daddy, there's a whole other role we can pick here. Upon defeating another Big Daddy, we can still choose to harvest the Little Sister on the spot, or we can adopt her. What this means is the Little Sister will ride on our shoulder and guide us towards angels, the corpses that they extract Adam from. Upon approaching one of these corpses, we place the Little Sister next to them and they drain the Adam in this minute-long sequence. Now, splicers are addicted to plasmids, to Adam more specifically. So when the Little Sister starts to drain this, they smell that and they will come running. And for the next minute, you have this Horde mode essentially, where you have to fight off a wave of splicers. Now, this doesn't sound like it should be much of an issue, granted. The issue with it comes that you have to do this multiple times per mission. up to 3 times in later missions. That's 2 times per little sister, which means a minimum of 4 times on early levels and a maximum of 6 times on later levels. And while a Horde mode with Bioshock 2's updated combat mechanics sounds like it should be a great time, it's not. Enemy spawn times are very inconsistent. This means the combat is in these weird little spurts where you'll have a few seconds of mowing down 3 or 4 splicers and then 10 to 20 seconds of nothing while you wait for some more to possibly respawn. And again, this wouldn't be that much of an issue if it wasn't for the fact that we would have to do this multiple times. And before I give my solution to how I would have handled this, I will state for the record that these are optional. You don't have to do these. But if you're not harvesting the little sisters, then the amount of Adam you get from this is next to nothing. So if you want to afford your health upgrades, your tonic and plasmid slots and your plasmid upgrades, you really have no choice other than to do this. This is kind of offset a little bit as well with the fact that after you save a specific number of sisters, you do get gifts from them, which usually incorporate money, a new plasmid or tonic, and a large amount of Adam. So there is a kind of draw to wanting to do this. But I think the solution, again, much like the menu, is very simple. Instead of each little sister having to drain 2 corpses, we cut that number to 1. We then extend the length of the Horde mode and we bring in more enemies with more frequent spawns to just keep everything interesting. This way, you're effectively halving the time needed on gathering these resources while keeping a challenge in place that pays off for going through with the harvest of the corpses. You can throw in some of the harder enemies as well, like maybe a big daddy who is looking for a little sister and is about to go comatose, so has kind of got this last minute berserk rage on. And then on the levels where there are 3 little sisters, the last little sister, while she's draining the corpse of Adam, that could then be your fight against the big sister. I just think that could have been a roundabout much better way to handle this than spending upwards of 6 minutes of your game harvesting corpses, not to mention the time in between trying to find them. So upon completing Bioshock 2, you're going to be greeted with one of 6 endings. Your standard good, neutral and bad ending are here, as well as 3 other endings which kind of wedge themselves in between with really only a change of dialogue. And I'm not going to cover the ending here, as I usually don't, because if you haven't played this game yet and you want to experience it for yourself, I would highly suggest you go out and do so. Bioshock 2's story, even though it does get some criticism for being short, I think is rather enjoyable with the cutscenes you do get and its resolution. But it should be known that the creators of the game have gone on to say that there is no canonical ending to Bioshock 2. And with the ending of Bioshock Infinite opening up the multiple worlds string theory side of things, that technically means that, true for Bioshock 1 as well, every ending of Bioshock 2 is canon. But I personally believe that the best ending is the canonical ending, just because I'm a sap and I do like a happily ever after. Now, why do I then say, even though I've sounded mostly negative, that it's better than 1 or Infinite? And simply put, it is the gameplay. Bioshock 1 was a great game in terms of atmosphere and just one of the best narrative twists in video game history since probably Silent Hill 2. And while Bioshock Infinite told a very ludicrous and overall amazing story, just like number 1, its mechanics, again, just don't feel correct. Bioshock 1 had the mechanic of having to switch between weapons and plasmids, which could get some players fumbled on the controls or even break the flow of things for certain players. Bioshock Infinite, while it had a radial menu for its figures and some interesting figures to play around with, the fact that it was following convention at the time and restricting you to 2 weapons at a time really took the wind out of the sails for me, regardless of how incredible its story and its characters were. Bioshock 2 for me is the kind of merging of those best bits. It had a great story, it has great characters, but it one-ups both games in being the most mechanically sound in terms of weapons, combat, and plasmid. Bioshock 2 set out to do what a good sequel should: take what's established and expand upon them. So if you've played Bioshock 2 before, or you haven't played it at all, I would highly advise you to go out and either experience or re-experience this game again. While you might not agree with me that it's the best in the trilogy, hopefully you'll realise it's not as bad as some people make it out to sound. Bioshock 2 is the worst reviewed of the three. Now that sounds dramatic, because I am being overly dramatic. On Steam, Bioshock 1 and Infinite have overwhelming review scores, and Bioshock 2, while not seen as overwhelmingly bad, has mixed reactions to lukewarm reception at best. So full disclosure, when I was originally writing the script for this, I never actually bothered checking the review scores for the original Bioshock 2, only checking out Bioshock 2 Remastered. The original Bioshock 2 actually also has very positive review scores. Bioshock 2 Remastered, for some reason, has mixed review scores, so I thought I would just clear this up. Back to the review. If I haven't changed your mind with this review, I'm hoping that I've at least inspired you to go back and have a look for yourself. Because with rumours of Bioshock 4 floating around, having a refresher of the series at large isn't a bad idea at all. But before I can get round to replaying the Bioshock series again, I have another 2 reviews to work on. And my next review is going to be another game that I feel is severely underrated in Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.